What role do you think law firms suing the Ministry of Defence on behalf of alleged victims of war crimes have had in building demand for investigations by organisations like IHAT? And we're specifically looking at things like settling claims by paying out sums to claimants while not accepting legal responsibility.
I think I understand that question.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I do.
Okay, so what role do you think, I'll break it down to two, what role do you think law firms suing the MOD on behalf of alleged victims of war crimes have had in building demand for investigations by organisations like IHAT? What role have the law firms played in that?
Yeah, I understand that there's a large amount of IHAT investigations at the moment is because of Iraqi civilian claims. And we look at, Al-Swedi, for example, the law firm that brought that case, 1 year before the case was abandoned, supposedly shredded a document which would have proved that they were Iraqi insurgents, not Iraqi civilians. So that case collapsed. But the amount of money, taxpayers' money, that was spent investigating that case over 5 years, and I understand it was on legal aid money, so those lawyers are paid win or lose, is quite horrific. And a lot of IHAT time was taken up investigating those cases.
Yeah. And what do you think?
Well, I'd turn it around. I'd say look at Baha Musa. Then, that was a very absolutely genuine claim, and it was a public inquiry. It cost a huge amount of money. I just want to step in on the Al-Swedi thing before we all get carried away with lawyer baiting, because I don't think it's fair. I know a bit about the case, and when I read certain details, I thought this is just nonsense, because if you've served in a brigade headquarters, what they alleged could never have happened. But then if you work it through and say, okay, bodies were taken from the battlefield, thrown into the back of 4-ton lorries, chucked into the back of Land Rovers, we all know what soldiers are likely to do. Boot goes in a bit, treading on people, that sort of thing. And although the middle bit was obviously bogus, but you get the deceased person back, and there's a post-mortem by an Iraqi doctor that says the body's been shot, well, they certainly had on the battlefield, and had been mutilated and all the rest of it. And you're a defence lawyer and someone comes to you and says, look, I've got this post-mortem certificate and these are the allegations. What are you meant to do as a lawyer? And let's put it also on the record that the MOD, that this inquiry may not have gone ahead at all had the MOD not buried an ICRC complaint, another ICRC complaint for there's one at Baha Musa that came to light because I remember it, and there was one for Al-Swedi. So
can you just explain what that is?
Well, the ICRC obviously an independent, confidential, and the highest respected authority in the world in terms of what goes on the battlefield, and their mandate is to ensure that the Geneva Conventions are applied. As I understand it, they'd made a formal complaint about prisoner abuse at the time, and that at the preliminary proceedings before Al-Swedi, this ICRC report was not disclosed by the government. Well, I'm sorry, if you're trying to defend proceedings and you don't disclose a document, it doesn't look very good to the judge. And I speak to lawyers about it, and they said that the lawyer acting for the government said, we're stuffed after this. So, just before we sort of all bay for blood, I think you've got to turn it the other way around. I know some of these lawyers because they've spoken to me after Baha Musa. I was a key witness. And when I'd left the army, and I don't find them ambulance chasers, I find them people wanting to hold the government to account for what they supposedly have done.
Well, I think the key is there, holding the government to account, whereas a lot of this goes back to corporate responsibility and the previous inquiry that you had beyond endurance. The MOD is not taking corporate responsibility, it's just leaving the individual soldiers hung out to dry, as they've told me, without support.
But if there is a clear case where as what Mr. Cherry was saying about, a video that contains 2 breaches of the Geneva Convention instructing prisoner handling, why are the MOD, and we will get them in this, but in your view, why are the MOD allowing these solicitors to go after individuals rather than fronting up and taking the hit, so to speak, for structural deficiencies and training deficiencies?
I don't know.
I don't do civil litigation now, but I used to obviously in the past. I suspect part of the problem may well have been that the Minister of Defence, or through the government lawyers, have tried to settle small cases by paying a sum of money without prejudice, as it were, and hoping that
to make it go away.
Because it's cheaper than trying to defend an expensive case. But of course, £1,000 here isn't quite the same as £1,000 if you're perhaps a marsh Arab. So if you make a complaint that you were beaten, kicked, whatever, at some checkpoint on one day, and they're going to give you £1,000, it's Christmas.
Yeah, so that goes on to the next question. Do you agree with the department's approach of settling claims by paying out sums to claimants while not accepting responsibility?
I think it encouraged it, because my understanding is then that those claims were being brought and the lawyers bringing the claims were being paid by the government as well. So it encouraged a process that went on.
I mean, saying without responsibility is sort of legal nicety, an easy way of settling it, but it doesn't mean, I mean, if the MOD isn't likely to pay out, it won't. It generally settles where it's in a corner and knows it has no defence. There are plenty of rendition cases, for instance, where we know what's happened, but the the government have paid out, but it's highly likely that these events occurred. And 323 cases at a cost of £20 million is an awful lot of money, and it must be with substance and some merit.
Is there at no
someone's
stage
incredibly negligent in all of this?
Yeah, is there? Sorry, who's been incredibly negligent?
Well, I mean, if you're paying out money just willy-nilly,
yeah,
it's an awful lot of money for an awful lot of
cases.
And
at no stage is that sort of eye-watering sum of money gone out. Has anybody made an effort to say, sort of what's going on here? Do we need to have a bit of an audit about perhaps how we're looking after prisoners, how we're training our men going on operations, and that hasn't happened?
Not as far as I know, but again, I think it goes back to taking corporate responsibility for training and for communication within the armed forces.
Okay, thank you.
Nicholas gave advice prior to the war about how prisoner handling should be conducted, and there were lectures and training for the troops before they invaded. In the full knowledge, there was the corporate battle plan was that we're going to capture, I think, 13,000 prisoners on day one. And you have to make plans for them, and you have to make camps to accommodate them. We were not going to have, because the Kuwaitis wouldn't allow us to build prisoner of war camps in their country. That meant that we weren't going to have a prisoner of war camp ready to receive them on day one, which meant that we couldn't then comply with our Geneva Convention duties for the prisoners. So I suspect that every one of those prisoners is entitled to a claim, because there was a breach of the Geneva Convention, as he was kept in the open until a camp was constructed some days later.
I wouldn't go as far as that, because in international legal framework, I mean, quite a lot of latitude is given to an occupying power because of the sheer physical difficulty of doing it. So I haven't got a problem with that, actually. I disagree with Lewis on that one. But I do think the interrogation procedures, wherever they got signed off, and it certainly wasn't signed off by the army, because we were clear that we didn't give that advice, it was wrong, has drawn the army into a litigation of its own making. And that's the reason for the compensation. That's the reason for some of the corporate kickback on it. And I think soldiers are caught up in the middle of all this.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, what role has the European Human Rights Act had in bringing these cases forward, if any?
Well, nearly all of the cases are brought into the Human Rights Act.
Yeah.
We know now because of the litigation, and obviously Nicholas gave advice again prior to the invasion that he thought it would apply, and of course that was rejected. But
that was rejected.
That was rejected. However,
who by?
The Ministry of Defence. It's documented.
It's on the public record in the Bahamas Public Inquiry document. However, there's been a High Court case that now said, of course, wherever in the world the British troops are, much the same way as the Army Act and the Armed Forces Act applied, wherever in the world you are, the law of England and Wales applies. And so in the camp, where we controlled the camp, we could enforce our law. We couldn't enforce it on the streets, but in the camp. But all these abuses took place in camp.
And that's where the European Human Rights Act.
And we are subject, our servicemen and women are subject to the European Convention of Human Rights wherever we serve. And that's where it took place. And that happened in Iraq, and it's going on in went on in Afghanistan too.
But the really good thing, I mean, I would obviously champion that, because actually there's a safety net, so that wherever we serve in the world there's this common standard. So if you try and manoeuvre out of the Geneva Conventions, which is increasingly happening in asymmetric warfare, you have this common standard that will apply wherever we serve in the world. And thank goodness. And the other thing is, if you're talking about corporate responsibility, the great thing about the Human Rights Act is that the government, ministers are winkled out of their office at public inquiries to give account of themselves for what they did in it. And no other system will give you that sort of latitude. So if we're talking about corporate responsibility, the Human Rights Act is your thing.
Okay, thank you. I think Madeline.